Welcome to the Sensible Socialist Podcast, a podcast for the rational left.
We need to unite and work together if we're all going to get through this. Sounds like socialism to me.
The amount of people I see talking about socialism positively is actually staggering.
Do you think, do you really think that a proletarian revolution is just around the corner in America?
Grab your pitchforks and stab your mayor.
Your hero, Obama.
He's not my hero.
How heroic he comes
idiot. If Bernie Sanders were president, right, and he wanted to bring the same ideas as for socialism into this country, do you think that we would benefit?
Yeah.
But I just told you Venezuela is eating rats.
But I just want people to have health care. I don't want,
Same thing Hugo Chavez said.
oh my god. You people have, worms in your brain, honestly.
Welcome to the Sensible Socialist Podcast, a podcast for the rational left. I'm your host, Kevin Gustafson, and today with me is Davey Heller. Davey Heller is a Trotskyist from Melbourne, Australia, and a longtime campaigner for left-wing causes including anti-war, refugee rights, environmental protests, and other worker struggles. He's a former secondary teacher who studies history at Monash University, currently works in the environmental field. You can follow him on Twitter at socialist_Davey. He is also a contributor to classconscious.org, so if you want to learn more information about Davey, check classconscious.org. Today we're talking with Davey about Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, and the role and the position that I think the left should take when it comes to Julian Assange. He's been in the news quite a bit over the last 15 years or so, but I think the number of people, especially on the left, who have in some ways abandoned Julian Assange or swallowed liberal rhetoric about him and his role, at least in the 2016 election, should really take a listen to this episode, because it is important to remember the role of truth in media, and the prosecution of Julian Assange is yet another attack on freedoms that the working class has fought so hard to get and that are forever under siege. So with that, here's my conversation with Davey Heller. So, all right, I'm here with Davey Heller, and we are going to talk about what I imagine is going to be an interesting discussion, given the role that this person has played and the unfolding story that continues to happen. So, Davey, thanks for being on the Sensible Socialist Podcast.
Oh, well, great to be here.
So the first thing that I always ask, people who come on the podcast is just how they sort of got into the game, and so you consider yourself a Trotskyist. So I'm just wondering how you kind of got into socialism, and maybe a little bit on why Trotskyism in particular.
I got involved in left-wing protests in Melbourne, Australia, about 25 years ago, when I was about 18. And for many years I was involved in environmental protests and refugee rights protests and anti-war protests, did a lot of marching, organising protests. And in the end, I just, over the years, I realised these weren't separate campaigns. I started to see the links increasingly between all of these different issues, and I think a big turning point for me was probably in 2003. We had with the big protests against the Iraq War. We had about 300,000 people march in Melbourne alone on that day, when there was about 15 million people marching around the world to try and stop that war. And I'd been probably for the previous 15 years before that, been working on the assumption that if you could get enough people on the street and mobilise enough people, you would be able to stop or win what you were trying to achieve. And that was a it was on the one level it was very dispiriting, but another level it was an important lesson to learn that it would require more than that. And so I guess that at that point I became more open to looking around at different ideas that were out there. I'd never considered myself a socialist. And then I came across a website called the World Socialist website. And that was my real introduction to socialism and Trotskyism. And I found the arguments on that website very compelling. And I think my journey reflects the journey of a lot of people. When I came of age at 18 and started involved in politics, that was not long after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I associated, socialism with Stalinism. I didn't know that at the time. My journey over the last 20 years is a journey that a lot of people have been on, and increasingly so, to understand that that's not socialism, to understand the capitalism at the root cause of so many problems, and that we can't reform the system. We have to overthrow it. That's what people are. You talk about this a lot yourself, Kevin, that people are increasingly moving to the left, moving towards socialism. And I've been on that journey myself. So I guess that's where I'm at now. I'm not a member of any party. I help contribute to a socialist website called classconscious.org in Australia. But, I want to play my part now in developing a global socialist movement.
Awesome. There are listeners from on the Sensible Socialist from all over the world, English speaking and beyond. And I think many of them are likely from the U.S. and maybe familiar with the U.S. Situation in terms of the sort of left. But I'm wondering, could you give us a bit of a background about the left in Australia and what the situation is now, and maybe a bit of the history?
Well, I don't know how much
topic on its own, I know.
But I mean, look, it's not the dynamics. Look, capitalism is a global thing, and the dynamics in Australia, they're not that dissimilar in a lot of ways. Look, each place, each country has its differences, of course, but not totally dissimilar here to America. So we have a two-party system here like you do in America. We have a so-called Social Democratic Party, the Labor Party, which is our equivalent to the Democrat Party. And like the Democrat Party has moved further and further to the right over the last 40 years. Likewise with the Australian trade union movement. And we have, Trotsky said that the words to the effect of that the crisis of humanity could be reduced to the crisis of leadership on the left. And that's what we are experiencing in Australia. So we just had a federal election, which the Conservatives, our version, the Liberal Party, which is our version of the Republicans, just narrowly got over the line. They got over the line because the working class here has correctly lost faith in the Labor Party, It's a pro-business party. It's a pro-war party, as we'll discuss later in relation to Julian Assange. It's as wedded to the US alliance and US imperialism as the rest of the Australian ruling class. And there isn't a strong left-wing currently movement, a socialist movement in Australia. That's what we have to try and build, and we have to link to people around the world, and this is where we have to build and start building, because I don't think the dynamics, when I say that, I think that obviously the crisis in America is very acute, but that said, in Australia, we have a far right government. We're dominated by a two-party system, and and the Labor Party here is as corrupt and right-wing as your Democrat Party.
Yeah. So it's interesting. Yeah, the dynamics are not. I've always found that there are similarities between the United States and Australia, and for a while it seemed like Australia was more more British, I guess you'd say. But it seems increasingly that Australia is more American, and not. I don't think that's a good thing for Australians.
Well, we were, yeah. I mean, we were, obviously a British colony, but in terms of our history, post, as the decline of the British Empire, continued, Australian ruling class essentially switched to the US alliance during World War II. As the US came into the Pacific, our ruling class hitched its wagon to the US's ruling class. Yeah, and look, the Australian working class was, able to win some. We were able to win some good reforms under in the early within the 20th century through industrial struggle, through working class struggle. But like elsewhere in the world, in the last 40 years, due to the real the globalization of production, the true globalization of production. The union movement here, its role, like in America, changed from being able to win limited reforms on a national level to really from the 80s onwards, they really swung in behind. It was called, the jargon was making Australia's economy internationally competitive. And that, and so that was, that's been it for the last 30 years, a chipping away of industrial rights and attacks on the public service and privatisation and those things, which I think you're probably picking up on from America as us becoming quite more American, more. So that's been a process in this country. Yep. Yeah.
So that's helpful because I do know that there are active left-wing, groups and things going on in Australia, but both being in America and American, America always takes the center stage. So it's good to hear at least a little bit about Australia. But we're here to talk about something a bit different, and it's like I said at the beginning, and you mentioned it's I think a topic that is very interesting. It's very complex. And it isn't clear what the sort of, I guess, in some ways for me, what the appropriate position to sort of take is. So we're going to talk about Julian Assange. So I guess just as a way of a beginner, what is the quick, tweet version of the way that you think the left should look at Julian Assange?
Well, I think it's quite simple. Julian Assange is a publisher and a journalist who, through WikiLeaks, has published what he's being prosecuted for currently by the US administration. Is quite simply publishing evidence of US war crimes through the documents that WikiLeaks obtained from Chelsea Manning. Of abuses in Iraq, in Afghanistan in particular, and the release of the State Department releases that the WikiLeaks also obtained from Chelsea Manning, which were an incredible insight into the way that US imperialism works around the world and its relationship with the different ruling classes around the world. Those documents alone helped spark the Arab Spring in Tunisia, by exposing the corruption in Tunisia, which was one of the sparks for the protest there, which sparked the Arab Spring. In Australia, for example, we learnt that there were senior members of the Labor Party through those documents who were, quote, protected US assets, which meant that they were reporting to the US Embassy and filling them in on Australian politics. And that was important enough that the US State Department wanted their identities protected. And that not to be known publicly. The insight we got through those documents was hugely valuable. I don't know what you remember, but I was like tens of millions of people in the road. I mean, I knew I always opposed the Iraq War, but when I saw the footage of the collateral murder video of those Reuters journalists and civilians, including children, being shot from that gunship, that was That was deeply shocking. You know, the media, you know, your government, my government, they learned a lot from the Vietnam War. You know, they learned that footage of civilians dying horrible deaths under the US and our Australian ruling classes war machines. You know, it doesn't sit well with the working classes. It doesn't sit well with people. People have empathy, you know, so they learn from that. And both in Afghanistan and Iraq, that the truth of those wars has been hidden. And that collateral murder video just punctured that in a way that nothing else has, even really before or since, you know. So the WikiLeaks published this information, and from that moment on, there was a determination to make an example of Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, to shut them down and make an example of him. And it's been a vendetta since then, which is continuing. And now Julian Assange is sitting in Belmarsh in the UK in a maximum security prison, you know, and he faces potentially never getting out of jail. Or even, you know, worse, he could be, or as bad, really, who knows, executed in the US, you know. So this is a serious situation. And, you know, I have, you know, Julian Assange this isn't about Julian Assange being perfect or anything, but this is what he's being persecuted for. And if they can do this to Julian Assange, if an Australian citizen, a foreign citizen, he's not US, can be extradited back to the US for publishing information in the public interest, you know, and face 175 years in prison, what does this do to freedom of speech? What does this do to the ability of any of us to take a stand, to publish and speak of these matters around the world? If you can be plucked off the streets like this to face so-called, you know, US justice in a quasi-military court in Virginia in the USA, you know?
Yeah,
that was longer than a tweet.
No, yeah, that's all right. I mean, I think it's a good background because the WikiLeaks really comes to fore in around the 2006 period of time. I think that's when they started, and it does take a while for things to actually to come out. But I think for me, you know, I sort of cut my political teeth in anti-Iraq war stuff. I mean, I was like 15 and 16 when when it was going on, and I eventually had friends that went over and things like that. And so for me, it was like really personal. And I also watching the collateral murder video and learning about the things that came out in the Manning. I mean, because there was an Iraq war. The thing that I think people, especially when they're hearing WikiLeaks in the present period, they're hearing it in the context of the Mueller investigation, which I think we'll get to. But the role that WikiLeaks played in that situation can sometimes obscure what role they played previous. And there's a discussion to be had about the legitimacy of publishing classified documents, and whether or not, you know, there is something wrong with that, or that there is, whether that be morally, politically, or you know, or otherwise. But I think the importance of even the small amount of pulling back the curtain that WikiLeaks did with its original Iraq War and Afghanistan documents, and then eventually with the cables that came out. Because I mean, those are the big three things. Correct me if I'm wrong, but there's an Iraq War basically dump, and then there's an Afghanistan dump, and then the diplomatic cables, which are basically diplomats talking about how they really feel, and using the language of like realpolitik, you know, for those who've studied that. But the idea of like the sort of Henry Kissinger style, look, the U.S. is the hegemon, and our role is to make sure that we maintain this hegemony. And so there's a lot of people, I think, that might be thinking that Julian Assange has recently, gone from the Ecuadorian embassy where he was for nearly a decade, and because of what happened with the Clinton emails. But the real reason that the United States, like you mentioned, has targeted Julian Assange is not because of Donald Trump. It's because of WikiLeaks publishing of classified documents. And so, just to kind of have the discussion, what do you say to those who argue that yes, it's important to have transparency or whatever, but these are documents that are classified. They might reveal certain information about people that could put people in danger. What do you sort of say about the risks posed to people by the dissemination of this information, like you'll get from Chelsea Manning that WikiLeaks did, or like you had from Edward Snowden, the legitimacy of actually releasing those documents in the way that especially WikiLeaks does, where they just sort of dump it and let journalists look through it?
Well, firstly, I mean, even the US military in Chelsea Manning's trial had to admit that they couldn't actually find a single example of anyone being harmed by the documents that Chelsea Manning released. That was within her trial, her military trial. They couldn't provide a single example of where that happened. You have to put this in the context. I mean, we're talking about crimes of an historic level here. Like up to 1 million people have died in Iraq, hundreds of thousands in Afghanistan. And then you have these same, the government of the US and Australia and Britain turn around and say, participated in these wars and say, we're worried about people being harmed. I mean, this is an absurdity when it's coming from these people, who will stop at nothing, and have stopped at nothing. I mean, in terms of achieving their aim. So, and obviously in terms of classified information, I mean, this is what journalists do. This is what publishers do when they get documents, which there's a decision made on whether it's in the public interest, and then they share that with the public. And there's no doubt that the information that came out from the WikiLeaks, as you said, to pull back the curtain, was in the public interest. These are wars which are being, the entire Iraq war was a lie from start to finish. It was sold to us on weapons of mass destruction, which, wasn't very convincing to begin with. And then, then what? To establish a democracy in the Middle East, in Iraq. And then what comes out in those documents? I mean, this is what Chelsea said. She was serving in Iraq, and the cognitive dissonance between what she was reading in those files and what she was seeing in those documents and what was being said publicly was too great. She was reading about, people being dragged off the street in Iraq and being tortured and killed with drills and all sorts of horrific things by death squads, US-backed death squads in Iraq, in Baghdad. And it's, Edward Snowden, it was the same thing, he was cognitive dissonance, on the one hand, he was being told he was doing security work, and then he saw that the NSA were publicly claiming they weren't surveying the American population en masse, and he knew that to be a lie, and he released it in the public interest. These people are heroes, and this is, in terms, Chelsea Manning, I mean, people forget, and it's not discussed that often, she offered her documents first to the New York Times and to other mainstream publications, and they wouldn't touch it. They wouldn't publish it because they were too in bed, with the US establishment. Once WikiLeaks got it and they're going to publish it anyway, a lot of those other publications jumped back on board and also published it. But we wouldn't, if it wasn't for WikiLeaks, we wouldn't know. The curtain would not have been pulled back. So I don't think governments have the right to wage war and survey the working class and plan their crimes and their intrigues. I don't think they deserve secrecy, I think we all have the right to know about these things.
Yeah, that. I couldn't have put it better myself, honestly. When I went to law school and I studied war crimes and crimes against humanity and international law and human rights, and the one of the greatest crimes, like, you know, the only crime that's worse than genocide in international law is aggression. So essentially going to war. And the Iraq War, you know, Afghanistan is I think a frustratingly different situation. Iraq is a simple example of a straight up war of aggression that, like you said, costs millions of lives, destroys a country, does not put it on the right foot to recover, and in the course of it commits an unbelievable amount of war crimes and other crimes against humanity, and for which there are zero prosecutions. You know,
that's right.
And so the fact that the country is unable or unwilling to acknowledge the consequences of its own complicity in the worst crime, you know, the crime of aggression, but its own complicity in the crimes that come along with it, all the war crimes and things like that, make it necessary for those that have the information that is happening to release it. And so, you know, I think that even if you're looking at it from a philosophical sort of moral weight, even if anyone was potentially harmed or put in jeopardy by the release of certainly the Iraq files, it's outweighed by the enormous public interest that there is in knowing the information. And so in that case, I think that, what Chelsea Manning did in terms of, and I mean, I think it's important to what you said too, that WikiLeaks was willing to publish information that other media outlets were not able or not willing to, and that is a role that WikiLeaks played and plays even today. You know, and so I think that's also important to putting into context the role that WikiLeaks played in the 2016 election. So
I'll just quickly say, I mean, the reason they're so determined to nail Julian Assange and WikiLeaks is, he's demonstrated. It's an old model, you know, a journalist and a publisher getting hold of classified information that's deemed the public interest and publishing it. But it's the internet which is the game changer. You know, this information could be passed to them. You know, I mean, Chelsea Manning downloads it on a USB stick. I mean, they've tightened their security since then, but you know, this is what she was able to do at the time. You know, to download it onto a USB stick, to anonymously upload it to a Dropbox at WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks didn't blow the source. Unfortunately, Chelsea confided in an FBI informant, you know, Adrian Lamo, you know, but they would say she was able to upload this to WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks is then able to then share this information, you know, some of it curated like Collateral Murder, some of it in a more raw form, with everyone who's got access to the internet around the world. This is an incredibly threatening model. You know, people could go and look at these, the raw, you know, look at the State Department documents, you know, on their own computer, sitting in anywhere around the world. You know, of course, this is deeply threatening. So it isn't. You're not filing Freedom of Information Act requests and, you know, waiting weeks to get access to documents to have it then filtered through the New York Times or something like that. You know, what you're getting is the direct documents themselves, which I think make it, like, ultimately I do think people do depend on reporting on WikiLeaks
document dumps, because
Yep.
some of them can be ridiculously huge.
That's right.
And so finding, the needle in the haystack takes journalistic effort. But the cool thing is, once you found that needle in the haystack, you can go and look at the needle.
Well,
I think something.
I've done that myself, I've done that, like I said, the reference to the Labor Party protected assets, when I've been researching that, you Google it or whatever, you go onto the WikiLeaks site and you can find the State Department, I've found the State Department, letter which talked about Bill Shorten, who was our last Labor Party leader, and how it described him. You go back and you read it, and this is, like you're done politics, law, history. I mean, this is the power of a primary document, a primary source.
So the one thing that I think is important to talk about is why Julian Assange spent so long in the Ecuadorian embassy.
Yep.
And so in the context, as we kind of go along, you have the releases of the Iraq and Afghan war logs and the diplomatic cables, and then essentially after, I don't know if it was a visit or living in Sweden for a while, he gets in trouble with the law. So if you can give a background in terms of what happened with that. And
yeah, so this was in the middle of still those releases that we've been talking about. It happened all at the same time. So some allegations of sexual assault or was made against Assange in Sweden. He was actually, I think this was 2010, I'm sure, or 11, 2010. He was actually questioned in Sweden before he left. He stayed around to wait till he was questioned, and then he didn't leave until he had permission from the Swedish authorities, and then he went to the UK. Once in the UK, there was a highly unusual and politicised process which began. So the Swedes issued a EU arrest warrant through Interpol, I think it was called a red notice, wanting Assange to be extradited back to Sweden for questioning. It's important to note, right, still even 9 years after these events, Assange has never been charged with anything anything from Sweden. He has not been charged with a crime in Sweden. So this was about wanting him to be extradited for questioning. Assange at the time and WikiLeaks believed Sweden has I didn't know this, but Sweden is a pretty close, tight NATO ally with the US, and they had formed with having people renditioned from Sweden as part of the war on terror, and they have a pretty easy, a quick process of having people extradited to the US. And so Julian never refused to go to Sweden, but he did, in his lawyers, ask for a guarantee if he went to Sweden for questioning that he wouldn't then be extradited to the US in relation to his WikiLeaks work. And they always said at the time, and this was under Obama, they knew or suspected that a grand jury process had been begun in the US into charging him. And they always said that if they went to Sweden, he would be on extradited to face espionage and other charges in the US. He also said that they were welcome to come and question him in the UK. Documents have subsequently come out. So he resisted his extradition attempts to go to Sweden based on those grounds. When it became clear that the UK courts were prepared to have him extradited to Sweden, in 2012 he entered the Ecuadorian embassy to seek political asylum. And the Ecuadorian government under Correa at the time granted that asylum as a political refugee. They said he faces persecution in the US for his publishing work, and we're prepared to grant him asylum, and they did, as is his right under international law. But there's a little bit of fine print in international law that you're probably familiar with, Kevin, which says this doesn't apply to the powerful countries. It doesn't, you're not meant to claim asylum in the UK to flee America. This breaks the script. So they just simply didn't recognise it. Straight up, British said, no, we don't recognise Ecuador's right to grant you asylum. We don't recognise this as legitimate. Completely outrageous in terms of international law. They even talked about storming the embassy in the early days here into the embassy, which again, just shows the kind of lawlessness in relation to Julian Assange, or determination to get him. Julian was then, he at any point, the Swedish authorities and prosecutions could have sent someone over to question Julian in relation to the allegations made in Sweden while he was in the embassy. It wasn't like they didn't know where to find him. And documents have come out through Freedom of Information that as early as 2013, the Swedish authorities wanted to wrap up the investigation. And there was an email that's come out from the Crown Prosecuting Service in the UK where they explicitly told, they said to the Swedes, don't lose, where's the effect of, as well as us, this isn't a usual extradition process, don't lose your nerve. There's an Italian journalist who's put a lot of work, I can't remember her name exactly, he's put a lot of work into obtaining these documents through Freedom of Information. By 2016, the Swedes finally relented and did interview Assange in the embassy, which they could have done straight away. I mean, for anyone who thinks, for people who feel like the women in this case have been hard done by in Sweden, I agree. This is a case where allegations have been made and there's been no attempt to resolve this. It's only been used in a political way to drag it out as long as possible to try and extradite Assange back to Sweden and to smear him. Those women, this is for the women who made the allegations, hasn't been fair to them either. So he's been questioned. He was questioned in Sweden originally. He was questioned in 2016. It's been questioned twice. It's been dropped 3 times now. The first prosecution looked into it, dropped, and then it was reopened while he was in Sweden. It was then not pursued again in 2016 after they questioned him. And then there was an attempt to revive it again this year, which again has fallen by the wayside. So this is 9 years after the event. Still no charges. What can you say about this? I mean, you can be, it takes, I think, a high degree of naivety to say that the way that it's been treated, when it arose, and the fact that there's just, and it's still going 9 years later, that none of this has anything to do with Julian Assange's publishing work. I mean, I suppose you could make that case, but I think it's pretty weak.
Right. Yeah. I think it's pretty obvious the fact that this is, I think that it's another even thing that it is a crime of some kind of sexual capacity, just to give it extra tabloidability and things like that. I think that's probably not necessarily an accident. I'm not saying that there may not have been some basis for it in fact, but that's then been obviously used for political purposes. And I think you're very right to there is not necessarily a written piece of international law, but definitely an understanding international law that international law doesn't apply to the big countries, the great powers, and it also doesn't apply to Julian Assange. I think there's a number of different things that are unique in Julian Assange's case, mainly because it is an example of the United States in particular flexing its muscles and saying, like, essentially, fuck you, there's nothing that we can't do, we're the United States. And there's also, there's a principle in international law of like non-refoulement, and you can't send someone back to a country where there's a high likelihood that they're going to be tortured or killed. And the United States has the death penalty for definitely espionage crimes, and it's also we also use solitary confinement, as Chelsea Manning well knows, and that has been basically determined to be a form of torture. So if WikiLeaks, Sweden's obligation in this to essentially drop the irony too is that in August of 2020 the clock would have run out, the statute of limitations would apply, and so they wouldn't be able to charge him even if they wanted to, and so the grounds for which he was being investigated in Sweden would have ended. I think the problem is that the issue in the United Kingdom, the reason that he can be arrested was that he breached his bail conditions by staying at the embassy, and so I think that's why he's in the UK still and not in Sweden to supposedly face these allegations. That's
not entirely true. So after he was dragged out of the embassy in April, I'll just do the breach of bail thing. So yes, that's what the British authorities, the only crime that Julian Assange what he was being charged with, he's been charged in America, but the only crime in the UK he was dealing with was this breach of bail. So, which again is an outrage because he breached bail by pleading asylum. So, and they've thrown him, if they gave him almost the maximum they could have given him was 52 weeks, but they've given him 50 weeks, and they've classified him as they put him in it's been referred to as Britain's Guantanamo. Belmarsh prison is where they keep their people there convicted of terrorism and the most violent crimes, and he's being kept in solitary confinement right now in the UK under very harsh conditions for something which is people rarely go to jail for, which is breach of bail. So that's what he was. That was what supposedly gave the British authorities the right to nab him and drag him out of the embassy when his asylum was illegally revoked by the new Ecuadorian government of Moreno. And once he was in Belmarsh, the Swedish prosecutors did attempt to revive an extradition process to get Julian Assange to Sweden for questioning, but that actually failed thus far has failed in the Swedish courts. So that is, the moment has fallen over in Sweden. So the Swedish, when that was taken before some Swedish judges, I don't know exactly understand, but the Swedish judges basically said the prosecutors hadn't followed correct process, and that's fallen over for the moment in Sweden. So he'll be held for 50 weeks in prison in the UK for his breach of bail. But once he was in within week, I can't remember exactly, but very shortly after, he was also held in detention in the UK for breach of bail. That the US unveiled their charges and their extradition request. So that's the only outstanding extradition request is into America at the moment.
Gotcha. So I think during his period of time in the Ecuadorian embassy, Julian Assange becomes, I think, there was a sort of mystique, I think, and the fact that he wasn't like everybody knew where he was, and he gave speeches from the balcony of the Ecuadorian embassy, and was, I guess, partly involved in giving at least advice to Edward Snowden, maintains a presence in the news, eventually releasing, like you said, the information about U.S. involvement in Yemen as that picks up. But I want to talk a little bit about the 2016 and the role that WikiLeaks played, because WikiLeaks is named in the Mueller report and was involved in the sort of Russian project, I guess, from the perspective of the special prosecutor. And so I'm curious to hear from you how you see the involvement of WikiLeaks with the release of the Clinton emails, as they say, and the connection with Donald Trump. Because there is a liberal narrative in the United States that Julian Assange is a Russian puppet who wanted Donald Trump to win because he didn't like Hillary Clinton, and thought that, I guess, he would curry favor with Donald Trump if he released the Clinton emails and nothing about Donald Trump. And so I'm wondering what you find problematic about that analysis.
Well, unlike a lot of American liberals, I don't believe things which are asserted without evidence by, up to 17 U.S. intelligence services. Robert Mueller, go on YouTube, you can see Robert Mueller giving evidence to Congress about weapons of mass destruction, that they were in Iraq. There's been no evidence other than the assertions of the U.S. intelligence services that it was the Russians who hacked the DNC emails. We don't know whether it was a hack or a leak. We don't know. But, fundamentally, that's not the point. So if you're a publisher, it comes back to, if you're given material which is in the public interest and you release it, that's legitimate. What was actually released by WikiLeaks in 2016? Evidence that the DNC were rigging their own primaries to stop Bernie Sanders becoming the candidate for the presidency of the United States. That's what was released. Are they saying that it would have been better or fairer if A, that had never come to light, or B, WikiLeaks had held off? It would have been more democratic for WikiLeaks to hold off to after the election and then go, oh, by the way, the primary process was rigged. What else came out of the Podesta emails? Proof of Hillary Clinton's speeches to Wall Street, where she, spoke plainly and clearly to Wall Street about her, that when she was president, she wasn't going to make life hard for them, and we all know about Clinton was the candidate of Wall Street, So, yeah, this is, Donald Trump is a fascist, Donald Trump is a deeply dangerous, the Trump administration, the working class needs to overthrow this administration. There's no doubt about that. But what are they saying? That WikiLeaks as a publisher, it would have been more democratic for them to not release the information. And even if so in terms of whether they got it from the Russians or not, well, there's no evidence. If it was ultimately from a Russian source, that doesn't change anything in terms of the public interest of what was released. And it doesn't change anything if Julian Assange had an agenda or not. News publications and publishers have agendas, The New York Times has agendas when it releases things. So does The Guardian. So does every publication. But the question comes back to public interest. Was it true, and was it in the public interest? I would like to hear an argument that neither of those two things apply to the leaks from the DNC and the Podesta emails.
Yeah, I think it's important to know that Assange was a defendant in a lawsuit by the DNC that they filed in April 2018, and they basically alleged that WikiLeaks and Russian agents worked together, and so that they were that they were sort of in cahoots and in a conspiracy to to hack, and so that would make you know, Julian Assange liable for the hacking itself. And they immediately, like WikiLeaks immediately tried to dismiss the case, and eventually it was dismissed with prejudice in just last month. And the judge said that basically it's dismissed with prejudice because Assange and WikiLeaks did not participate in any wrongdoing in obtaining the materials in the first place.
That's right.
So he also said the DNC case was entirely divorced from the facts. And so
that judge didn't hold back.
Yeah, and so it just go like, and this is, you know, very recent stuff that's happening that's essentially clearing WikiLeaks of having done anything illegal, and certainly Julian Assange making the grand jury decision to charge a bit ridiculous. But and then the whole reason for the extradition to be spurious at best. But the situation here, I think that I want to underscore kind of what you said, is the importance of the fact that there's a dual thing going on in the 2016 situation of the whole fake news thing. And I don't know to what degree. I think a lot of different actors, including a lot of domestic actors, are trying to manipulate people through the use of social media, this new ability to constantly bombard people with information, whether or not that's legitimate or truthful information. It's information nonetheless, and will usually be consumed or assumed as true, and so you can engage in a public disinformation campaign. But that is 180 degrees from getting emails that people actually sent with things that they actually believe, and in a way to be able to show that they lie to the public, and releasing that in a way that isn't curated and saying only look at this stuff. If someone gives you a bunch of emails from corrupt people, and your primary obligation is to publish that information, and that's all that WikiLeaks did.
That's right.
They didn't conspire with Russian agents to do so, and when you look at the Mueller report, it is pretty specific when it says that WikiLeaks did release it, and there are I guess communications between Julian Assange and somebody like Roger Stone about the timing of the release.
Well, there's claims made for that in Mueller. There is Julian Assange. I think they've got there's leaked Twitter DMs between WikiLeaks account and Donald Trump Jr. I don't think there's anything on Roger Stone. I think Roger Stone just went around mouthing off, claiming to be a back channel because Roger Stone's an inveterate liar.
Well, that's definitely true. Roger Stone is a giant piece of shit. I mean, let's just put it that way. But I just think that nothing that WikiLeaks did here and nothing that Julian Assange did here suggests that Julian Assange went out to find somebody who would hack just the DNC in order to tip the scales in the U.S. election towards Donald Trump. He said, I think it was with Amy Goodman on Democracy Now!, that choosing between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump's like choosing between cholera and gonorrhea. I'd prefer neither. I think that I think it's pretty clear what Julian Assange thinks about the most recent presidential candidates and isn't in favor of either. And so I think that it's very suspect to imagine that if somebody is releasing information that is bad for some people, that it means that they are on the other side. I think that is really an example of the degradation of the American political discourse in some ways, where you can't even assume that that someone is doing something because they just think it's the right thing to do, no matter who it hurts. And I think in Julian Assange case, he's pretty clearly going to release classified or otherwise embarrassing information so that people can know what's going on with the people who are running their countries.
I mean, one of the things. I mean, he also one of the things is he did release also WikiLeaks released the Vault 7 CIA files in 2017. You know, that was under Trump. You know, and deeply embarrassing for the US, but the US administration. You know, and I think probably prompted the Trump administration to really escalate their attempts to persecute or to prosecute him. You know, but it's look. This is all missing the point, you know, whether can't see into the mind of Julian Assange, you know. Perhaps there was, you know, even if he did have, like, he'd been in the embassy for 4 or 5 years in the sights of the US imperialism, if he entertained briefly some deluded ideas that, you know, a Trump victory would be, you know, a Trump administration would be less likely to go after him than a Hillary Clinton information because of the animosity that Clinton you know, and the Democrats had already expressed for him. Who knows? Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. It doesn't change anything. This is in the public interest, truthful information. There's no information yet that WikiLeaks had and withheld information, as you said, on Trump. Trump, you know, I'm going to give you good to say about him, but, you know, you can't accuse Trump of hiding who he is, you know. Like, what was WikiLeaks going to release that would expose Trump? That he's a racist, fascist, billionaire demagogue? Okay. But it's, you know, and for these liberals to turn around and, like you said, it's a debasement. Even if that's what they believe, what a debasement of their own politics and supposed principles, that they cheer on a far-right fascist government's prosecution of someone for espionage, you know, a publisher or a journalist for espionage for publishing war crimes, you know, of the US. Because why? Because they felt that this person hurt their candidate during an election. I mean, this is to say that this is unprincipled behavior. I'm sorry, I can't give any quarter to it. It's a debasement, like you said, you know.
Yeah, it's. I mean, and I think it's. It just goes to the ridiculousness of the American political dynamic in terms of the Republicans and Democrats, because it is so much because they are so similar, and everybody kind of knows that they're both the party of capital. That the horse race part of this is what really is what really is behind the whole, like, you hurt my team, and so you must be on the other team's side. And it's a debasement of any kind of genuine politics, and it's such a veneer. I mean, both of those sides can tough it out in terms of who didn't win the election, but either way, the rich are going to get tax breaks, and the system is basically going to function exactly like it has been. You know, I mean, Joe Biden, who's leading in the Democratic field in the United States, recently told a group of rich people that under his administration, don't worry, nothing will fundamentally change. So there's a certain understanding that it doesn't really matter Republican or Democrat, because they're still both going to serve the interests of big capital. But I want to. Julian Assange was in the embassy until what was it, April of 2018? 2019, yeah, this year.
Yeah.
So what accounts for the change in terms of the ability to, I mean, he's granted a political asylum, stays at the Ecuadorian embassy in London, and what happens? Send us through that.
Well, I think things changed on two levels. One, clearly, I mean, Obama wanted to prosecute. There's no doubt Obama wanted to prosecute Assange as well. They had a grand jury process that went on for years. Whilst he was, it went on for years under Obama. But it's been reported that the Department of Justice under Obama did balk at espionage charges for Assange, based on the fact that if you charge Assange with espionage, there's no real distinction in legal terms between what he's done and what the New York Times has done and what the Guardian has done in terms of publishing the same information. So I think in some ways Obama was happy to leave that investigation open and leave Assange stuck in the embassy, second guessing whether if the second he stepped out he'd be whisked off to America. So Trump was elected, and then, as I said, in 2017, Julian Assange and WikiLeaks released the Vault 7 documents. And soon after that, Mike Pompeo, I think at the time he was the head of the CIA, described WikiLeaks as a non-state intelligence actor. And around the same time, people started being questioned around the world and pulled before the grand juries. And as we know, also Chelsea Manning was should be noted at this point, because I'm not sure everyone knows that Chelsea Manning's currently sitting in jail in America as well for her refusal to cooperate with the grand jury process to prosecute and persecute Assange. So, she's. I'm not sure everyone knows that, because it's not being talked about as much as it should be. Trump was elected, and Trump's. Even though Obama wanted to prosecute Assange, it's also true that Trump, even though both parties in America are capitalist parties and pro-business parties, it's also true that different sections of the ruling class have different strategies in how they prosecute their aims. And I think it's true to say that the Obama Democrat section of the ruling class still felt there's some value on presenting America as, under the rubric of the force for, the world's policeman and for promoting democracy around the world. Of course, that's a lie, but it was a rhetorical flourish that Obama was very good at pushing, that narrative. Whereas Trump's come in, he's not into niceties. It's the rest of the world will do what we say, and we're going to demonstrate why. As he said, Trump says things like, he did a couple of weeks ago, we could have ended the war in Afghanistan in 10 days, but would have cost 10 million lives. This isn't a man who hides anything behind rhetorical flourishes about democracy. So that inhibition, I think, was also removed in terms the Trump administration doesn't care if it's seen to be prosecuting journalists. And in fact, that's part of their agenda. So changes happened within America, but also probably most importantly, changes happened within Ecuador. So, Correa was part of the pink tide of kind of leftist bourgeois nationalists who were elected and in government in Central and South America. But he'd served, I think he could only serve 2 terms. And Lenin Moreno was his deputy. Stood for the president after Correa couldn't stand anymore because he'd done his 2 terms. But when Lenin Moreno was elected on a platform of continuing Correa's, as I said, leftist bourgeois nationalist politics, it became evidently clear very quickly that Moreno wanted to reset, so to speak, Ecuador's relationship with the US, which meant being more obviously servile to the US. And he did literally describe Assange as like a pebble in his shoe, So he wanted to reset this relationship, get a big IMF loan, which is what he's done, and move and implement austerity and open up to more US investment. And yet sitting in the embassy in London was this thorn, this pebble in the shoe of the US empire in the form of Julian Assange. So he increasingly made life more uncomfortable for Julian. I mean, even though I've known about Julian Assange for a long time, I didn't really get active in the campaign until June of 2018 when Leonard Moreno cut off Assange's internet and started making noises that he was going to kick Assange out of the embassy. And yeah, that was when, I felt like it was important to get involved and start organising protests around this. And it dragged on until April, so from about June of last year through to April of this year, until Moreno finally just pulled the plug and called the UK police in to drag Assange out and just announced that he had revoked his asylum. So that's what changed on the ground, I suppose, was changes in America and in Ecuador. The UK have been consistent. They've made it clear that they'll hand him over, arrest him as soon as he walks out the door and hand him over if asked.
Yeah, I think it's important to mention too that there was, for, like you said, for 9 months or so, constant talk about Julian Assange's imminent removal from the embassy, and then it wasn't until photos surfaced and a story ran on WikiLeaks that tied Moreno in with a corruption scandal did they finally actually pull the plug. And so it's just WikiLeaks being WikiLeaks and, again, reporting on and releasing information about, embarrassing things about governments all around the world, and not saving Ecuador merely because he's at the embassy. It then leads to his removal and arrest. And like you said, he's sitting now at Belmarsh, and and you said he's 50 weeks, and that was May of 2019.
So he's due for release. I guess that would make it about January of next year. So incidentally, he's nothing's a coincidence in this, but it seems obvious that they're trying to keep him under these very harsh conditions for as long as possible. To break him, but also so he can't participate in his own defence. It'll be a matter of weeks before his extradition hearing in February of next year. February 25th is scheduled for, that he would be let out on his. But they won't even let him out then. I think they'll probably keep him in remand. So, but it makes his own defence very hard to be held under these conditions in Belmarsh, under these maximums, like a supermax.
So that, in some ways brings us up to the present with Julian Assange.
Could I just interject just really briefly? I guess one of the governments that we haven't mentioned is the Australian government, and he is an Australian citizen. But the Australian governments of both stripes, both Labor and Liberal, which is our Social Democratic and Conservative side, they've been come and gone in the 10 years of this saga, or 9 years of this saga, and all the way through, they refused to speak out or lift a finger for Julian Assange. Denied for years that there was, even though they would have known, that there were secret charges in the US against Julian. Julia Gillard, who was the Labor Prime Minister in 2010, preemptively said that what they'd done was illegal, even though, and that she would fully cooperate with any extradition request from Australia to the US for Julian Assange, which is why he had to seek political asylum in another country. He's the first person who's successfully sought political asylum effectively from Australia as well. And even currently now, the Morrison, the far-right government we have now, again, they just keep repeating, this is a matter for the UK courts, as if this is just like the most standard, matter with that, as opposed to it being a political show trial. They just kept repeating that and refusing to intervene. So the Australian government as well has played a really shameful role in this in the last 10 years.
Yeah, it doesn't, and it's basically because the government of Australia hasn't in any way supported him. He he is still an Australian citizen. I mean, I don't know when the last time he lived in Australia, but it would seem to me that he would have the government of Australia would have certain rights and obligations according to maintaining his safety, but they have seemed to fundamentally thrown off any of those obligations.
Completely.
Yeah, ridiculous. I guess the next thing in terms of the next sort of big event in the Julian Assange situation that is not going to happen until February, which is when there'll be a full extradition hearing. So I think it'll be very interesting to see what happens with that. I mean, I think that I wonder just if you could play, fortune teller or future seeker for a second. What do you envision happening to Julian Assange, or what can people do to make sure that the worst doesn't happen?
Well, this is a political trial. This is the legalities, so to speak, of this trial are a fig leaf for a cover for a show trial for an extradition to the US. It's effectively like a rendition, to the US. He's been nabbed, and they're trying to give this a fig leaf for the UK courts. His lawyers have to get up and make a legal case. Obviously there's so many legal grounds which would prevent Julian Assange being extradited. It's for a political offence. He faces the possible death sentence. He already had asylum. This is for journalistic work. All of these things would, if there was any semblance of fairness or legality around, it'd be, he would not be extradited to the US. But this isn't a standard trial. This is a political trial. The only way to defend Julian Assange, essentially, the only way that the courts will, let's not pretend that the courts are immune from political pressure. They're behaving like this in the UK because they're being instructed to by their ruling class, because their judges are part of their ruling class. They know what to do. But there is another social force that exists in this world. As Marx told us, there's the ruling class, the capitalist class, and there's the working class, and it's only by activating the working class internationally to fight for Julian Assange, to get them to understand that this is a fundamental case in terms of the attack on the press, in terms of the rights and the abilities of all of us to stand up to imperialist war. And then, in fact, the campaign to free Julian Assange is integral to both the fight against the drive to dictatorship that we're witnessing around, and fascism around the capitalist world, and the preparations for World War III. They know one of the reasons it's important to shut Julian Assange up is to stop people exposing future crimes, that they're preparing. So, and then they have all they're doing in Yemen, but they're preparing, what is it for as they call great power conflict. So, we know what that means. So, this is part of that struggle, and as for workers and the socialist movement, if we don't have the freedom to publish, if we don't have the freedom to find out what our governments are doing, if we don't have a free press, we can't advance any interests of the working class, industrial, political, none of them. This isn't the only thing happening in the world, but this, to some degree, exemplifies the broader battles. If it wasn't important, they wouldn't have spent 10 years and enormous amounts of resources the ruling classes throwing themselves in a coordinated conspiracy to get Julian Assange into jail. They think it's important because it is. And this is the message that we have to get out. This is why I'm so glad, Kevin, that you put this on your show out to the Marxist audience that you have internationally. This has to become one of the things that the Marxist movement attaches to its banner, to work, to activate and to mobilize the international working class. Nothing else can save Julian Assange. Nothing. He's in the hands of the class enemies, in their clutches now. He's in a dire situation. It'll only be through a massive mobilization in America, internationally, in Australia, around the world, as part of a broader struggle against war and for freedom of press, if this man is going to be freed, if he's going to avoid the worst fates in the US justice system, in the US prison system, which we know what happens to people.
Is a horrible situation.
Yeah.
I just 100% echo everything that you just said, and to say to anyone listening, follow what Davey's saying here, and I think you'll find him and his position echoed a bit by none other than Pamela Anderson, which I've found very fascinating. All this sort of stuff. I remember seeing Pamela Anderson. Has been interesting in terms of the Yellow Vest movement in France, and but also her comments on Julian Assange. I think that they're actually well worth checking out because she has said similar things, that that this is something that might be easy to forget about given the ebbs and flows of modern communication and social media and those kind of things, but that the situation of Julian Assange is important for everyone, but specifically anyone who is trying to go up against or fight the imperial aspects of even the current ruling class hegemony. Because one of the things that WikiLeaks, I think, was really important in doing is casting a light where there is a lot of shadows, and where you see how empire is really done. And the only way to be able to really fight something is to know how it really works. And that's something that WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, has given us. And so, I think this issue is really important. It isn't talked about enough, I think on the left. And like a lot of other really important things, it doesn't get as much coverage because it forces you to take a particular stand. And in this case, I agree with you that the stand is true information that's in the public interest deserves to be released, no matter who it embarrasses or who it could even hurt. And that's what WikiLeaks has done, and it's been in general a service for the people, especially those who live like us, who live in imperialist countries, to be able to understand what the government is doing, quote unquote, in our name, but really in the interests of the ruling class. Is there anything that we have not covered that you want to cover? Because I think that what you just said there was a good outro, but I want to make sure that we talk about something that you wanted to make sure we talk about.
No, I think, well, I don't know. If people have stuck with this for the last hour and a half, I probably don't want to probably used up my allotted times in most people's lives with the last hour and a half. So, I think that was a good point to finish on. So, I just, I encourage people to get involved. I mean, as I said, this isn't a campaign which is separate to all the other struggles of Marxists. We have to make this part of our struggle. Part of our struggle against war, part of our struggle against dictatorship, part of our struggle against capitalism, but it's an important part of it, and it needs to be linked as we fight against these other things. We have to see the connections. And if Marxists, our job is to raise the consciousness of the working class, to get them to understand how the system works, and this is what true information is for. We have to take a principled stand on this. Like you said, this is one of the issues where you have to choose which side of the barricade you're on. And it hasn't been spoken about. Lots of people who call themselves left, frankly, have chosen the wrong side of the barricade thus far. But they need to get on. Things have become. There's nothing good about a capitalist crisis. We don't wish on the acute growth of the capitalist crisis, but it is clarifying. And if people are not clarified by what's happening right now in the world, if their thinking isn't clarified by the side of a publisher facing 175 years in jail for espionage, for publishing documents in the public interest, by the Trump administration, well, yeah. What's it going to take?
Right. That's like you said, that's a fundamental part of just the ability to get information that's true. and your, like you said, your consciousness is never going to be raised if you don't have access to the truth. And so that's what WikiLeaks has done. It's given us the truth, and the idea that anyone should be punished for publishing what's true. If you take a position other than that, my eyebrow is raised and my suspicion is high, because I don't know whose interest you're serving, because it certainly isn't mine.
Yep, absolutely.
All right, man. Well, it's been great talking with you.
Yeah.
And you know, check out this. Where can people find what you've written at? Say that again.
Classconscious.org.
All right.
Yeah, that's me and a few comrades from Australia. That's our website. We've written on the Julian Assange campaign, but also other things to do with trying to raise consciousness of the working class. So yeah, you can read some of the things we've written on classconscious.org.
All right. Well, check that out. Thanks, Davey, for talking with me, and and we'll be in touch.
Yeah, thanks for giving us the opportunity. Thank you very much.
No problem, man. Take it easy.
See you later. Thanks. Bye.
Later.